Lovely. We have a special treat today, a little bit of something different from our normal single speaker presentations. So we're going to be thinking about how you can take a clinical healthcare need and then think about how you put that need first to really develop solutions and using AI, and the goal being patient transformation. So we have several folks who have gone through a program to try and meet that need. And they're going to tell us about their experience going through the program, how the program, and a little bit about the program's origination. So our bios, because we have so many people, will be short. These folks are all extremely exceptional. I'm going to try and hit the highlights of their exceptionality. So Dr. Liviu Klein is a professor in the Division of Cardiology. He is a local expert here in heart failure and cardiac arrhythmias in patients with heart failure. And his research really focuses on developing new diagnostic therapeutic devices and how AI can impact the cardiovascular disease in patients with heart failure. He's the director of the Advanced Heart Failure Comprehensive Care Center, as well as the section chief of advanced heart failure, mechanical circulatory support, pulmonary hypertension, and heart transplant. That will be followed by Dr. Shweta Modiwala, who is an associate professor in advanced heart failure and a transplant cardiologist. She directs the heart failure disease management program at UCSF and treats patients across the spectrum of heart failure, from diagnosis all the way to circulatory support and heart transplantation. She's interested in how chronic disease management for patients with heart failure and technology can affect clinical outcomes and quality of life. And her research looks at both biomarkers to understand response to therapy and the use of remote monitoring technology to optimize guideline-directed medical and device therapy to improve both access to care and transitions in care. And Dr. Jin Ji is an assistant professor of medicine in the Division of Gastroenterology at UCSF and in the Division of Clinical Informatics and Digital Transformation. He also, as an affiliate faculty member in the UCSF Bakar Computational Health Science Institute and the UCSF UC Berkeley Joint Program in Computational Precision Health. He's a transplant hepatologist, and his research focuses on using clinical informatics, data science, and artificial intelligence to improve care for patients with liver disease. Last, we are joined by Rush Bartlett, who is a 5X startup founder and corporate executive who's served in multiple leadership roles, CEO, COO, chief product officer roles at companies across many stages, from startup to well-developed companies. Currently, he's the CEO of Sluice AI, a SaaS platform for biodesign process, and author of The Hidden Wombat, How Executives Innovate. His previous startup, Vinca Health, has helped more than 1 million patients and it employs more than 200 people. He served as Stanford Biodesign's Associate Director of Corporate Education and a leader of UCSF's Needs-Driven Innovation course here, and an EIR for the University of Texas Innovation Center. So we're delighted to welcome them all, and I'll call Dr. Klein to the stage first.
Thank you, Michelle, for this kind introduction, and I'm really thrilled to be joined by my colleagues here, and really share my disclosures. What we're trying to do today is to really describe how adopting a needs-based framework can actually help us to uncover high-impact opportunities in care, research, and program development. So this is not necessarily about how to start a startup, although it can be applied to that, but really a lot of us here think about innovation in healthcare delivery or in research, and how can we actually do that, and in the end explain how AI, everywhere AI is around us, right? Everybody's using AI, how AI can actually help narrow down these features and really streamline the innovation discovery to patients. So if we think about innovation in healthcare, our way of traditionally doing things in medicine has been discovery, right? We really generate new knowledge, discover a biomarker or discover CRISPR as a treatment for, gene editing tools, or we discover a new antibiotic. All these are discoveries that, essentially will lead to, papers, will lead to patents, prototypes. But in the real world, the real world is driven by innovation, right? Where we translate the knowledge into practice. We solve a problem in a way that actually impacts outcomes. So either improve process, efficiency, or cost. We have Teslas, we have Ubers. Those are things that really change lives in real life. The unfortunate part for a long time and still, healthcare is really thinking inside the box, right? We're really constrained, and we're constrained for a number of reasons. We have heavy regulations, CMS, FDA, HIPAA, et cetera, et cetera. We have fragmented stakeholders, right? Patients, policymakers, payers, regulators. We have a misalignment of incentives between, patients, providers, and payers. There's a high cost of care, especially if you want to switch from one place to another. Even though you may not be able to get the best care, you get the care that you can afford. And finally, as physicians, I think, or healthcare providers, we're really very adverse to risk, right? Throughout our training, we've always been taught to be adverse to risk, partly because, lives are at stakes and you don't want to make a mistake that could cost somebody's life. But that unfortunately has translated into maybe dampening our progress. So oftentimes what we do is really trying to patch a hole in the tire, right? Whatever problem is let's just find a solution to just deal with that. And that really hasn't, helped us a lot. And real innovation, if you think about healthcare, real innovation is very scarce. Again, because we've always thought about a solution-driven approach, and we now think, that we should actually flip the script and think about a needs-driven approach, and how would that apply? So if you think about, again, consumer market like Tesla, if they had a solution-driven approach, they would just build a really cool-looking car with novel gadgets, right? But that's not what Tesla is, right? They thought about, okay, what are the needs? Well, we need sustainable, appealing transportation. And what's the solution? Well, mass market EV production. We need a grid. We need a charging network. We need an ecosystem. And that's exactly what they built. So if you think about sort of their mission, maybe something like that, I don't know, see if Elon Musk agrees with that, but something like that, right? Drivers and communities need a way to reduce reliance on fossil fuels and greenhouse gas emissions while still being able to access reliable, affordable, and appealing, personal transportation. And that's how, Tesla is born. Think about Uber. If they thought about solution-driven, they'll just build a new taxi fleet, dispatch kiosk, an app to, order a taxi. But that's not what they did, right? They saw the need, which is what? On-demand, reliable personal transportation, affordability. And the solution was an app that connects you immediately, passengers and drivers. So their mission might have been, their mission statement might have been, urban residents need a way to obtain convenient, reliable, and affordable transportation without, being inconvenienced of owning a car or relying on, the scarce taxi availability. And that's how the idea was born. So why don't we have that in healthcare? Well, I can tell you one story from my own world, which is heart failure. We have a really broken care system. We have a heart failure patient that, has symptoms. They're not always able to detect those symptoms, either because they're very insidious, things are progressing very slowly, or they just don't realize that they have symptoms. They see us in the office, right? We have 20 to 30 minutes, depending on the template, right? So it's limited time. We have limited staff, right? The MAs are not available. We have to room the patient, get blood pressures, and we have almost zero tools in the office to detect anything. If I want an echo, I have to schedule it 3 months ahead of time because we don't have availability. I have no cool gadgets in the office that can detect anything on this patient. Maybe I can get a POCUS to look at that. But again, just very limited interventions. I can't really do anything. We finally opened a diuretic clinic in 2025, so we can give diuretics in clinic now, right? So very limited things we can do. So we give some advice, make some med changes, and patient goes on their way. They may be getting labs, they may be getting the change in meds, but eventually, unfortunately, a lot of them get worse, right? So what they do, they show up in the ED. That's the place to get treatment. Of course, the ED has no relation with the patient. They don't know the patient. Patient is symptomatic. What's the safest thing to do? Medical legally, admit the patient. So patient ends up in the hospital on our service. We don't have beds. So day one on MDR, first question, when is the patient going home, right? That's what we have. So we have 4 to 5 days, which is usually our average length of stay, to do a bunch of things, figure out why the patient got worse, do some tests, try to get fluid off with diuretics, try to educate the patient, figure out their social situation, their medications, et cetera, et cetera. And then, patient goes home. No surprise, 20% of patients come back within 30 days, 30% of patients within 2 months, 50% within 3 months, right? The readmission cycle just continues to revolve because we provide reactive care. And that's unfortunately has been the MO for, at least for heart failure, for a long time. Of course, payers get into the mix and CMS says, well, if you are having a readmission, we'll penalize you. So the hospital is like, well, we're going to get penalized. We got to do something, right? So let's focus on the hospitalization and the rehospitalization because we know how to patch holes, right? So what do? Well, we have people available. So let's have a call center. It's going to call the patient within the first 24 hours after discharge to see how they're doing. And if we identify some symptoms, we'll tell a nurse, we'll call the patient, maybe call an NP or an MD, trying to figure out what to do. We'll call a pharmacist, trying to, change medications and make sure they're on the right medications. We'll try to reach out to our social worker if they have any issues getting the meds or housing, etc. And we can see them in clinic in a week. We're doing all these things, which really remind me of this great movie, Saving Private Ryan, where you're sending 8 people in to bring 1 person out, right? So really the mission is a man, right? All these resources trying to patch a hole. That's just not sustainable. And unfortunately, we've been doing this for a long time. So I think it's time to move from patching the hole to really stop and think, what do we really need? So about 20 years ago, a bunch of us got together and thought, how can we actually change this? Well, we need to really find a way to do something for somebody to alter an outcome. So we thought about, okay, heart failure is a hemodynamic disease. We know that if you're in the hospital and get a right heart catheterization and we find increased filling pressures, that's bad. We know how to treat them. That's good. So maybe we can do this as an outpatient basis. So then we came up with, a needs statement that was way before we actually have that framed in an intelligible way by the Biodesign program and folks. So what we thought about we need to do is to detect proactively hemodynamic changes in patients who have heart failure to prevent the hospitalization. So there was a very simple exercise that took a long time to come to, but it was very clear then what we needed to do. I'm fortunate to partner with the engineer who was able to develop a sensor. He was also an interventional cardiologist. He initially wanted to develop the sensor to monitor pressures into the aorta, and we kind of switch things around. And I was fortunate to be at the right time at the right time in the right place. I was a fellow at the time, and they needed somebody to put these things in ships. So who's going to do it? A fellow. So I end up putting a bunch of sensors in ships, and then eventually we're able to go to humans. But there was a very simple concept that you have a sensor that can go into a part of the body, in this case in the pulmonary artery, and it's an inert sensor that doesn't do anything. But then if you apply radio frequency to it, it actually acts as a capacitor. So it can get you pressure waveforms. When you apply the inductance to it, and you can get pressures from the patient from their home. It's very easy to implant. You can put it through a procedure called right heart catheterization, which we do all the time, and you can leave it there. The patient at home can lie on a pillow, send this data that we see over a web-based interface, and the pressure generation, it's incredible. It's just like in the cath lab. So for the first time, we're able to have this data sent from a patient's home that we would only be obtained until then from the cath lab. Of course, we had to prove it clinically that it works. So we conducted a study called Champion. Starting in 2007, October 2007, we had the first patient. And essentially what it did, had 550 patients who had class 3 symptoms of heart failure, recently discharged from the hospital. Every single patient got one of these sensors. And then for the first 6 months, half of the people were blinded to the pressure. So the physicians, for half of the patients, we did not know their PA pressure. We knew their weights, their blood pressure, their symptoms. In the other half, we knew the PA pressures as well. So we could treat the patient based on an algorithm to normalize the PA pressure. So at 6 months, the primary endpoint was hospitalizations for heart failure. So I'll draw your attention to the bars on the left. The central bar is the number of hospitalizations in patients who are in the control group. So the physicians were blinded to the PA pressure. The bar on the left is a patient who were treated according to the PA pressure. And what we saw was a 30% reduction in heart failure hospitalizations. Again, for the first time, we showed that a diagnostic device really can impact care, impact hospitalizations. But what's interesting, it's actually the bar on the right. So these are the patients that after 6 months, everybody was unblinded. So in the control group, the physicians now suddenly had access to PA pressures. And what we've seen in the subsequent 6 months, we saw a 48% reduction in hospitalizations. So again, same patients, same physicians. The only difference is physicians now were treating patients according to the PA pressure. So that kind of proved the point that once you know data, once you know the hemodynamics, if you follow the algorithm, you can actually change outcomes. So this was pretty huge at the time, and something that in 2005 was an interesting concept and cool to implant in a sheep, actually got FDA approval in 2014, and we were the third hospital in the US to implant this device in our patients. And finally, many years later, we finally made it into the guidelines, where now it's a 2B, so not super high, but it's in the guidelines that you can treat patients with this hemodynamic monitor in order to improve their outcomes. And hopefully in the future, with more data, we'll move up in the guidelines. So what have I learned during this journey? I think really focusing on the need yields a better outcome and can change the paradigm in healthcare. We also learned that the future of heart failure is really remote monitoring. And we've started to now innovate again and think about, now that we know this is working, can we scale it up, right? You can't, we have 7 million patients with heart failure. You can't really implant 7 million patients with hemodynamic sensors. We don't have the resources and the financial, resources to do that. So can you scale it to something that's non-invasive? What about wearable technologies? So we're working now, and we actually presented the data last year, and hopefully next year will be approved by the FDA to have a first wearable device that can measure intracardiac pressures. And really, our goal is to be as good as our endocrinology colleagues, to have patients self-titrate medications based on their pressures, right? People have done this for diabetes for a long time, so finally we can hopefully do that for heart failure patients. And my personal journey, I moved here 14 years ago because the innovation in the Bay Area, and sort of doing this, I really realized that we don't have a course that teaches a lot of us how to do things in a proper manner. So how can we bring a course that can, teach us a repeatable framework for success? And that's where we partnered with Christine Winoto and the Roseman Institute last year, met Rush, and fortunately, able to engage him to lead this course for us. We had our first cohort last year, where we had exclusively DOM faculty attending it, and Jean and Shweta are two of the 7 that attended that. And then fortunately able to expand this year, where we have a really broad representation across UCSF. We have nurses, physicians, we have family practice, we have ER, we have surgeons, really attending the course. And it's in full-fledged. It started last week. I'll transition to Jean, who will tell us his experience with these concepts and the course.
Thank you, Weivy, for the kind introduction. And I'm actually really glad that you're speaking about CardioMEMS as the major innovation, because that kind of figured into some of the research project that Shweta and I decided to take on after going through this course. So I'm Jen. I'm a transplant hepatologist. I think I was the only non-cardiologist that was in the previous group. Here are my disclosures. So my research is funded by the NIDDK, ACG, ASLD, and PCORI, but there are a bunch of other financial relationships, which have all concluded actually, and so they're no longer active. But basically, the course was a 10-week course around this time last year, and I came to the course first of all a little bit not knowing what's going to happen, but also with a very discrete clinical problem. And this is something that I, as a transplant hepatologist, see very often in my practice. A patient who has heart failure, who has nodular liver, and basically they come in, and the question that we always get is there cirrhosis or not? And the positive predictive value of an ultrasound showing nodularity for cirrhosis is only about 60%. And so in 40% of these patients, the most likely outcome is that they actually don't have cirrhosis. And if you have evidence of congestion, as in somebody that has a clinical history of heart failure, that positive predictive value of that ultrasound goes down even more. And I would say probably less than 20% end up having cirrhosis. But this creates a very interesting clinical conundrum, because in that 20% of patients who actually do have cirrhosis and also have heart failure, what do we do with those patients? And do we have to get them set up for a combined heart liver transplant? And so that's a problem that Shweta and I have been on the phone before, talking about discussing our patients, but we actually never met until we came to this course. But this was the clinical problem I actually brought into the course with. And the idea is that how can we evolve this very discrete clinical problem of like figuring out who needs a combined heart liver transplant into a need statement that may launch to some sort of diagnostic product that can be used in the situation. And so basically, we had formed a team called Team Synapse, and our idea was that we started with about 20 different need statements between multiple members of the team, and then eventually we refined these need statements and then focused on the 27 discrete needs that were specifically on this intersection between chronic liver disease and also heart failure care. And so when we went for this process with the help of Sluice AI, we finally ended up at 2 different refined need statements. One is basically focused on heart liver transplantation, very much according to this initial clinical problem that was brought here. And then the second problem, a little bit more broadly, is actually the diagnosis of cardiac cirrhosis. How do we determine if somebody with heart failure actually does have congestion so bad that ends up becoming cirrhosis? So I think there were a couple of very important insights from the course. The first is basically the shift from a solutions first to a need driven framework. Second was we had multiple conversations with mentors throughout the course, and these were mentors basically from biotech, from medtech, and investors. And I think there was a lot of time spent during the course that Shweta and I were very concerned about the technical feasibility, how the thing that we were how our need statements were leading to a product, if that product can actually do what we want it to do. And I think a part of it was actually letting go of these concerns about technical feasibility after speaking with the mentors and getting a sense that the technology is actually probably the simplest part of the entire journey, but it's more of like defining what the needs are and defining the population for which it worked. And then throughout the process, we ended up incorporating tools such as stakeholder interviews, economic analyses, and really getting iterative feedback from the mentors to refine the need statement. And then some of the tools and frameworks that we gained throughout the course includes like, how do we filter need statements? How do we calculate the potential value? HMW, which is how might we, a really imaginative way of thinking about how can we change or how do we improve a certain state, and really filtering down on the concepts. And so, throughout this refining process, we eventually got to a need statement, which is a way to monitor the progression of congestive liver disease in patients with advanced heart failure to guide heart failure management and decrease the incidence of cardiac cirrhosis. So really combining both considerations on both organs and then refining to a statement that captures the addressable populations very broadly, but is able to sort of like allow us to think about the solution from here. And so talking about the solution, since the course finished, I think in January of 2025, we actually commissioned a retrospective pilot study to determine the potential associations between chronically elevated right-sided heart pressures and abnormal liver imaging. So abnormal liver imaging, thinking about the nodularities that will eventually become cirrhosis. And then for the right-sided heart pressures, we actually co-opted the CardioMEMS. And so this is a very, preliminary pilot study where we looked at 35 patients with who were implanted CardioMEMS and looked at their abdominal imaging within 6 months of measurements. And we actually showed that in this very small cohort that each 1 millimeter mercury increase in the diastolic PAP was associated with 1.4 odds of an abnormal imaging finding on abdominal ultrasound. So, and when you get a threshold above 20 millimeters mercury, it was actually associated with 2+ abnormal abdominal imaging findings. So we submitted this to the AASLD liver meeting for this November. It was accepted as a distinguished poster. So Chelsea Pan, who I believe is a 2nd-year medicine resident, is leading this project, and she'll be going to DC to present this. So, cool. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So as you heard, my name is Shweta Motiwala. I am one of the, I'm gonna adjust this. I am one of the advanced heart failure attendings here. And so you heard a little bit from Jin about our journey working together, and I'll give you my perspective on basically the same journey. But to start, I think you need to know a little bit about me, which is that I am primarily a clinician. I have some formal training in research methodology, and I've experience in clinical research. But at the end of the day, I'm usually thinking about direct patient care and how to improve it. And so I have sort of a particular interest in taking care of patients with chronic heart disease in the outpatient setting. So figuring out how to improve their access to care, improve the implementation, as you heard a little bit of therapies that we know have benefit, but their implementation gaps. And in the process of this, thinking about novel devices and kind of approaches to improving remote monitoring and heart failure optimization. So I went into this course with absolutely no experience with innovation or entrepreneurship, and was really interested in thinking about how to more effectively do the things that I was interested in. So focused less on starting a startup or becoming, full-fledged researcher, and more thinking about how to improve programs and how I might use some of these techniques and skills to improve what I was already doing. So I have no relevant disclosures. Okay, so what did I learn over the course of these 10 weeks? Some of this you've heard from Jen, some of it might seem very obvious, but it was for me really a process of kind of unlearning and relearning in a different way. So to start, it was for me a brand new conceptual framework of needs-based innovation, which you heard a little bit about what this means, and I think Rush is going to walk us through it in more detail, but it is very, very different from what many clinicians do on a daily basis. And we are trained to think about things, as Liviu mentioned, in a solutions first way. So they're discrete problems, there is a solution, we need to find it and move on. And this was a very new, for me, way of thinking about things, which I think is really, it took a little bit of work to get comfortable with. I also learned how to brainstorm without constraints. So without saying from the get-go, this is why this idea won't work, or for X, Y, and Z reasons, we should not pursue this option. And I think that we do that on a daily basis much more often than we realize. And so removing some of those constraints and brainstorming freely was another new skill. I thought it was very informative to go through the process of iterative filtering of our needs statements and then incorporating feedback in kind of an unbiased way. And that was also new because that really required not going in with preconceived notions and setting aside the ego. I think Rush may have told us to do this at some point. Set aside your ego. Oh, I'm hearing myself again. because of what I was going to say is that you have to set aside, what you think you should be doing and what you think you know about yourself and your ideas, and not be so attached to the ideas that you start with. And I had to set aside, what I would consider my self-proclaimed brilliance temporarily to make adjustments. And then another thing that was very new to me was thinking about how to approach economic value calculation. So this is something that I had absolutely no experience with. And it becomes very important when you're thinking about what the market might actually support, or funding agencies might actually support, or where you're actually going to get buy-in, how to engage the stakeholders and what they care about. And so that was also completely new and very it was compressed in this 10-week course. And so for someone with no business background, I learned a lot there. And then very importantly was recognizing the value of unique insights. So we all have them from things that we do every day. And I think it becomes helpful to start thinking about how the things that might be day-to-day questions or day-to-day insights that we all come across, how they can be shaped and molded and iterated in a way that they make sense and draw in other people. And they're not interesting just to you, but figuring out what really can sell your ideas. So I gained that. And so what did we accomplish? You heard some of this from Jen, but I had the very good fortune to be teamed up with a group of people with a wide different backgrounds, different areas of expertise. And it was fortunate that Jen and I converged in some of these ideas focused on the heart and the liver. But I started out with a lot of need statements that cover the spectrum of heart failure problems. So things having to do with atrial fibrillation and HFpEF, about AKI post-transplant, about quality of life. And as we started really nailing down what was interesting to us, Jen and I converged on this intersection between the heart and liver. And it was helpful because he thinks about advanced liver disease in much the same way that I think about advanced heart failure. And we had these clinical questions that we had collaborated on and worked together on. And that really drove some of the need statements that we put together. And we initially focused on this very niche area of heart and liver transplantation. And it was at this point that the mentorship became very important, because we got a lot of useful feedback about why that may or may not make sense for the broader population that we were trying to treat and the stakeholders that we were trying to engage. And so we ended up focusing more on the congestive hepatopathy and thinking about the advanced liver disease or liver disease that's due to heart disease, and how we might be able to initially diagnose cirrhosis more effectively, or in some cases, even prevent its development. And that led us to this solution of the continuous hemodynamic monitoring of congestive hepatopathy. And so this is something that still needs some work, but that we have now a concept and a potential solution, and something that we'd eventually like to try to pursue. So where does that leave us, and what are the next steps? So for me, it will be more research. I think more research is needed. We can't use innovation to disrupt the status quo if we don't yet have robust data telling us what the status quo is. And so we're starting to try to develop that with a pilot study that Jen mentioned, using the CardioMEMS, coincidentally or not, that Libby focused on. And we're also working with one of our advanced heart failure fellows now, looking at a slightly different patient population with more advanced heart and liver disease, and thinking about some projects in that area. And there will likely be more. And then the other big piece is collaboration. So in addition to the working with Jen on these projects, the course really put me in touch with incredible colleagues and mentors, and opened my eyes, this wide universe of potential collaborators who aren't necessarily all clinicians. In fact, most of them are not clinicians, and they have areas of expertise and skills that are very different from mine, and maybe really synergistic in ways that I don't even know yet. And so I think that is going to be a big part of what I take forward from this course. And all of this brings us back to what I said in the beginning. So using all these skills and tools that we've gained from working together, and what we learned during the course, to try to improve the care of patients with heart failure, with just maybe a new innovative mindset and new tools in my toolbox. So thank you, and I'm happy to take questions later, and you'll hear more about the details from Rush.
Excellent job. It's an honor to be here. And just in terms of disclosures, I do a lot of consulting. I have some startups, but the big ones relative to this program is that I am the author of the book and also one of the co-founders of the AI tool that the teams used. In terms of my talk today, it's really about understanding first, what is biodesign and where does it fit in with other innovation methodologies that you may have heard of, why using AI can help, and then a bit of Q&A and what's next. Some of you may be familiar with how difficult it is to innovate, but the data is actually quite shocking and it's quite variable depending on where you look. 9 out of 10 startups fail. Only 2% of NSF I-Corps companies actually get acquired. Less than 40% of investors actually return any money at all. And that's because really, if you have an idea, this is a multivariable math problem. You have a need, as was described, and then you have a solution that is baked together into one thing. And in reality, the product market fit, feasibility, technical complexity, stakeholder adoption, market access, reimbursement, clinical pathologies, everything is kind of fitting together and all has to be optimized and solved. And so it's no surprise that when research is done in the entrepreneurial field, that they can really trace back the reason for a failure in innovation back to either it was a bad unmet need or the wrong unmet need that that team was focused on. Now, there's a lot of innovation methods that are out there. Biodesign was initially invented in about 2001. Design thinking was at Procter & Gamble in the 70s before being productized at the Stanford School of Design in 1999. The first one is this fuzzy image over here. This is TRIZ. That was theory of inventive problem solving. That was by a Russian patent agent at the end of World War II, and so on and so forth. So this is not an old problem of making innovation more repeatable. And most people, when they talk about problem solving, they say start with the problem. It's very obvious. Or start with the need. And if you look at what the FDA says in their medical device documentations, it's all about what are the user needs. If you talk to most medical device companies, it's what does the user want? It's what do you all want? But you all know that the most important person in this equation is usually the patient, because that's the only reason you're here. And so in the concept of needs-driven innovation, you begin this process by really focusing on the anchor stakeholder, which in healthcare is almost always the patient. And if you do that, you can be flexible of maybe changing who the user is, changing who the customer is, changing where you're solving that patient's problem. If you move down the timeline, design thinking becomes extremely powerful when you have identified the real crisp clinical need, because then you're solving the needs of the user that is required for that specific patient need. Subsequently, down the timeline, again, it's jobs to be done in design thinking, design to value. These are customer needs focused. This is where you optimize sort of the solution around your business. And then finally, Lean Six Sigma, which is about the business processes for actually delivering that solution. And so I look at this not as that there is one single best process, because that's a fallacy. The truth here is that innovation is a timeline, and these are all tools, just like a math problem. And if you use the right tool in the right order of operations, you can get the right answer in a much more repeatable, reliable way. To illustrate that even further, if you have first fixed who the anchor stakeholder is and what is the need around them, what's the patient care about, then you can define what level of effectiveness and safety that would be required for any kind of solution to be adopted in a solution agnostic way. After you define that, then you can go pick the environment. Is this something that is done in the cath lab or something that's at home, like in the CardioMEMS example? And depending on where you're picking that environment, then you can define who the stakeholders are that are in that environment. Different set of stakeholders in the cath lab versus at-home pressure monitor. And so those criteria that those stakeholders demand from any solution are then all built out. And so you essentially create a math problem that defines what the solution looks like before you even brainstorm. Now, when you do this correctly, the outcomes are incredible. So Stanford Biodesign has been doing this since 2001. About 85% of the companies that come out of that cohort, which they run 3 teams a year, are still alive or have already been acquired. 26% of them have been acquired, including Shockwave Medical, the most recent one by J&J for about $13 billion. You can compare those stats to Y Combinator, to MIT's Incubator Delta 5, I-Corps, and just the VC industry average, and they're quite impressive across the board. And I like to say that it's, Palo Alto is great, but the truth is that there's smart people everywhere. And many of the people that were leaders in the program at Stanford actually came from UCSF, just as an FYI. So the goal here is to demonstrate that this process is the language of innovation, and it can work anywhere. You have people that are willing to take a chance and go through in a disciplined way of what this innovation is. And it works in India, it's worked in Singapore, it's worked in Ireland, probably the highest per capita hit rate in terms of companies that have become funded. It's also worked in corporate. A lot of different companies have used it. But as mentioned by the example here, it doesn't have to be a startup. Innovation is not just patents. It's not just startup companies and IPOs. And in many ways, like in the CardioMEMS example, these are overnight successes that took 20 years to get there. And you can have a lot more direct impact a lot faster by innovative research, by quality improvement programs, by healthcare policy recommendation changes, by a number of different solution implementation methodologies that don't necessarily have to involve creating a new company, splitting up equity, going to raise money, all of that stuff, which is fine if that is your passion. But if your passion is research, this is a tool set to more deliberately and precisely focus your research on high value things that could be more impactful to patients and more likely to get funding. So innovation to be repeatable. Biodesign has a brilliant textbook that you should all look at if you're willing to go deeper into this process. Just a fair warning, it's 880 pages, so it's a little bit dense. And it is quite heavily focused on the medical technology industry, but a lot of the same process techniques are great. And there's also a beautiful student guide on the Stanford Biodesign website. In my book, we talk about it as needs-driven innovation because biodesign is a very medical context, and we've used this process in other industries as well beyond medtech. The secret to what makes this so successful is just statistics. So if you have 100 need statements, or in the case of Jen and Shweta, you had 50 or so need statements. And then you sequentially select those down in a solution agnostic way, asking single variable questions. How well do we understand the mechanism of action? How severe is the impact to the patient? How quick would it be to actually see a data point result from an experiment to run in terms of the outcome being achieved? Those kinds of key questions will help you enrich or select, like you would a drug for evolution or for whatever else, down to what is the optimum best need area. That's 1 out of 50, let's say. You do the same thing for solutions, sequentially filter that down to the best 1 out of 50 solutions. And so the pairwise combination of those two things is the best 1 out of 2,500 things that you could have been spending your time. And that dramatically increases your chances of success. It's not 100%, but it's not 2%. Now, the way you filter these things and you prioritize is different based on what maybe you might have been thinking about previously. So some of the things we talk about in the course is it's a different thing to talk about what is the value of the need compared to what is the market size of a solution. Because market size is the price of the solution multiplied by the number of uses it could be in a year. But if you don't have the solution, you have to calculate value a different way, usually based on cost or opportunity lost or quality improvement life years or some other measure of the benefit that you're providing to the ecosystem. And there's a variety of other filter criteria as well. The foundation of all this that lets us move very quickly is the need statement, which is a way to problem population outcome historically in an academic context, evolved to be a way to address a problem. And then I talk about it as a way to what's the need for the population and then the outcome. And if you bake this into what is an example, a way to proactively detect ICD-AS 1 or 2 dental caries in homes or early stage tooth decay for adults between 18 to 45 years old to prevent irreversible damage to tooth structure, this is exactly what you have to do. But it doesn't matter how you do it. There's a lot of different hows. There's no solutions embedded in this need statement. And any solution is possible at this early stage. And if you frame it like this, then what you end up with is a framework that allows you to do a lot of different filtering and evaluation of just the sentence, because the downstream effect of structuring this need statement, I could calculate what the value would be and what the per person maybe willingness to pay or price might be. I know what the cost of filling would be. I know how many times that occurs. I know the percent effectiveness of reversal of these early stage tooth blemishes if you're able to check them early and implement corrective action. And so then I know that the economic benefit that's available if you could reverse 75% of these early stage blemishes from getting a cavity would be about $2 billion. I could take a haircut on that, and there's a whole methodology about how to do that, but the market size must be less than the value that you're creating for the ecosystem. So let's say it's $400 million. 400 million divided by 20 million teeth gives you $2 per person per year that they would pay for passive detection in order to prevent the need for a cavity in this population. So you can see very quickly why this is still a need, because there's just not enough there on a per person basis. And that's because at the need statement level, this will sort of stack sequentially up the chain, where you build the need statement, then you build the must-have, nice-to-have criteria that we, so you've got to think outside the box in terms of the need statements. But once you have the need statements, you're building the box that the solution has to fit inside. And then that leads to concepts, business planning, and product innovation. So there's a lot of different tool sets, a lot of different criteria that we can go through in terms of how the course functions. And to become an expert in all of this would be a year plus just for biodesign, multiple years for a lot of different innovation frameworks. And Sluice AI is the tool that we use during the program to help with that. You might be wondering, like, why did we name it Sluice? Well, I thought we were being clever because we're all engineers, not marketers. We thought it was a gold mining machine. But then I gave a talk in Cambridge, and some of my UK colleagues reminded me that actually a sluice room is the waste disposal room in the hospital. So maybe we're not so good at creative marketing. But fundamentally, what this does is it's a way to kind of quickly mine through research. So very similar to most LLMs you've probably seen. So we've uploaded a paper, but we've trained it to identify the specific context around need statements in the biodesign innovation framework, and also what insights might be particularly relevant based on the model of how that works. And so it produces quick workflow improvement opportunities. And so now we've got a dozen or so need statements with different insights. And then similarly, we can take any one of those and we can sort of unpack that quickly into, let's see if I can just jump to the middle. We can go to, so iterate that. And jump through the sort of economic value assessment of this. And it will do a calculation, pull in market data, pull in peer-reviewed evidence, and then help us very quickly understand where to spend our time in terms of how these needs might be prioritized or not relative to each other in more of a competitive set. So I'll just let that run for a second, but any questions? That's the last slide on the list, and we have about 10 minutes for Q&A, I believe.
Well, thank you to all of our speakers. I will take the prerogative of the first question. If everybody could, come up, stand next to me for questions. I am really curious about this blend of like taking the need and then trying to expedite that through the use of AI. So I'm just curious, Jin and Sweta, if you could tell us about, like, how did that translate? How did it feel to actually take all of these needs and then do that very painstaking analysis of, like, which is the right need and which is the feasible need? It seems like downstream there's so much effort that comes once you've identified your favorite need that I would love to hear more about how that process felt to you and what tools you used and how impactful that was.
I would have to say it was a very painful experience and trying to figure out which needs really mattered. And I think part of it was the Sluice AI tool really helped us in a very systematic way to figure out, okay, what are the criteria that we needed to filter our needs? And I think a very concrete example was that, Shweta and I came to this with a set of initial need statements that focused very much on the heart-liver transplant, intersection. How many heart livers have we done in the past year? 3. And so if you think about that, even though it's a very high value problem, it doesn't affect that many patients. And I think, like, working through the Sluice AI tool, we kind of came to that realization relatively quickly. And this is where the real work came to be, where we had to identify a need that was broader, applicable to a larger patient population, that still had a lot of clinical urgency, but could address a much bigger economic opportunity, and therefore have a much greater chance for it to become a startup or being funded as a research idea. And so I think like that's where really going through the program and really going through the Sleuth AI structured sort of tool helped us to refine these needs and get down to exactly what actually mattered and what didn't. And so, the heart liver idea it's great, but when we only sort of like when that addressable population is probably only about like anywhere from like 20 to 100 patients per year, it's not a very big economic need there.
Turn it to our in-person audience before we go online.
Questions?
Future entrepreneurs have a great idea. Want to ask?
I can talk about one question that came up online, which was how great some of these innovations are in sort of like high tech spaces. And also at the same time, we have a lot of patients who have, a lot of obstacles to accessing even basic medical care. And so how to sort of reconcile that and use these techniques in more of like a public health lens.
I could say that the Vinca Health, my previous startup, it focuses on palliative care and end of life. And a significant number of our patients that we're actually caring for under management are patients that are experiencing homelessness, have not great situations around them in terms of support. So the need itself is sort of agnostic of what is high tech or low tech. And when you really focus in on that, like I'm a chemical engineer by background. I never expected to work in palliative care. But the need just kept rising to the top of the list. And then the constraints of, who's going to pay, how much is it going to cost, how much can they afford to pay, if anything, which is nothing, usually. All of those questions just become constraints that you would use to then solve the problem with a solution that would work under all of those weights.
Yeah, I would just add that, so I agree with all of that, but we focused on innovative devices today because I think that's where our specific interests lie. But I agree that that the process and the way of identifying the needs and then filtering and then coming up with potential concepts, that can be broadly applied to any of these sorts of questions. And it, like we said, it doesn't have to be a new product. It could be a research question. It could be a new program, a way of reaching the patients that you mentioned. And I still think that I would think of this as a set of tools as opposed to a funnel to product development.
Just want to add on to that. I write, so as a clinical investigator, I have to write a lot of grants. I have to write a lot of specific aim statements about, or pages about sort of like a problem that we see in clinical practice and what is the solution to get there. Going through the course and having a needs-based approach to doing this has made grant writing much easier because ultimately, sort of like, if you think about like the last sentence of the first paragraph of a specific aim statement, that is your need statement. Basically, you are trying to solve an unmet need, a way to solve X by doing Y. And so having that framework and going through the class really helped me hone my ideas and actually made me a better grant writer in terms of better defining what is the actual need or what is the actual problem that we're trying to solve, and then launch into, okay, this is the potential solution.
Excellent. Well, if you are too shy to come to ask your question out loud, please feel free to come to the front. We've got a couple more minutes. I'm sure these folks would be happy to stay after and talk about their experiences. But please join me in thanking all of our speakers today. This was really a wonderful experience to get to learn from all of you.